So basically, there are informal groups like what we've been talking about. We've been talking about groups of people who organize around a specific cause. So, for example, people who organize around gay rights or against gay rights, people who organize around Black Lives Matter, all of those are informal groups. Informal groups also include things such as groups of friends, groups of people who may gather afterwards after a religious or meeting. Those are all informal groups. But formal groups are actually part of social institutions. For example, people who belong to a church are part of a formal group. People who belong to a family are part of a formal group. People who belong to a business are part of a formal group. The thing that distinguishes formal from informal groups is that formal groups have usually written down or formalized norms and rules dictating them, versus informal groups still have norms dictating them, but they tend to be more informal and informally enforced, like what we were just talking about. So, for example, in my informal group of friends, I may be teased for the way I'm dressing. So I have informal modes of social control. Whereas in a church situation, if I showed up in a specific form of dress, I may be formally sanctioned and say, hey, Kate, if you keep showing up to church dressed like this, you're not going to be allowed to come anymore. So that's one of the ways you can tell the difference between an informal and formal group is how they mete out their social control. Another way you can tell the difference between a formal and informal group is how they get their members to become members. So usually in formal groups, there's some sort of initiation process, such as if I join a new business, I get hired, I have to go through an interview process, I have to go through new employee orientation, I have to go through training. So that's a mark of a formal group. If you are part of a family, you are usually born or adopted into the family. And there's a big process involved with being born or being adopted into the family. If you belong to a church, you may show up to the church informally once or twice, but to become a real member of the church, you may have to be baptized, you may have to attend organizational meetings. So mostly for formal groups, there's some sort of initiation process and that would be the same for cults. There's an initiation process. For certain gangs, there's initiation processes. So those are all markers of a formal sociological group. An informal group, such as my group of friends, there's no initiation process. You may start hanging out with us and we like you, and all of a sudden you're part of the group. We haven't sent you to an orientation meeting. We haven't hazed you. You're just all of a sudden a part of the group. Another example of an informal group would be, what's another example of an informal group? An informal group would be people who gather because I use the example of people who gather because they are all against gay marriage, for example. So again, if you are against gay marriage, you just kind of gravitate to become part of this group of people. There's no process to become part of them. You just become a part of them, and you share the same belief systems, and there's no orientation, no hazing, no initiation process to become part of that informal group. So two of the things that differentiate formal and informal groups, the first is that you have a hazing or an initiation or an orientation process to become part of a formal group. And the other thing that differentiates formal and informal groups is the fact that formal groups have usually more defined norms and rules, whereas informal groups used informal processes of social control to enforce norms and rules, versus formal groups usually have more formal forms of social control.